want to tell you about 4 of the amazing airwomen of World War II who inspired me to start writing fiction. I'll tell you a bit about their lives and the incredible things that they did during the war. But the talk's also about my writing journey and the story of writing when we fall. Because it took a long time. It took more than a decade to write this book. And I want to explain a bit about why that took so long through the stories of these 4 women. So from having the idea to write a novel about airwomen in World War II, to the publication of the book When We Fall was 12 years, and it was actually 12 years exactly, quite spookily to the day. And I can date this process because my urge to write fiction arrived kind of out of the blue on the 8th of May 2008. And I can remember this day because that was the day that I read in The Guardian the obituary for this woman. There she is, Diana Bonato Walker. Now, this is the picture, the iconic picture that also appeared in the obituary on the 2008 obituary of Diana. And as soon as I saw this photo and I read about Diana's amazing experiences in wartime, I was just captivated really by the story of these women. And I felt that it was a story that needed to be told. Now, before that day, and before I found out about Diana's life, I'd never heard of Air Transport Auxiliary. But again, the story was enthralling. The idea that women during wartime were flying the fastest machines in the world in the dangerous skies above wartime Britain. And I was really enthralled by the glamour and the danger of those stories. Now, Diana herself was a very glamorous figure. She was an heiress and a natural horsewoman. She was beautiful and charming, and she was an amazing pilot as well. But her life was also punctuated by tragedy. Both her fiance early in the war and then just after the end of the war, her new husband were both killed in flying accidents. So she had a tragic life, one that, again, full of drama that seemed ripe for a story to be told. And I thought really that if ever I'm going to write a novel, it's going to be about someone like her. And once that idea was planted in my mind, it just wouldn't let me go. And I started on this long journey of researching and writing about women at the very sharp end of World War II. I thought this journey might take me a few months and I might be able to write a book, you know, within a year. And I very soon afterwards realized that that was not going to happen. Partly I got rather bogged down by research. I was just so interested in all of the wartime stories that I was looking into. It was hard to let those go. I visited local archives at the Maidenhead Heritage Centre, which has the ATA archive there. And I think I read almost every memoir that was published by the women pilots of ATA, of which there were many. In total, 164 women served with ATA, flying planes around Britain, and many of them did write books. And a lot of the stories that they told were really enthralling. You can see from some of these pictures the story of ATA. On the top right, hopefully not obscured by your bar or by my face, you'll see some of the first 8 of the women who started flying planes around Britain in 1940. Now, when Air Transport Auxiliary was set up, it was envisaged as a way for civilian pilots who were unable to serve with the RAF, already had flying licenses, to help the RAF by flying new planes from factories to aerodromes and from maintenance units to RAF, so that the military pilots wouldn't be tied up with what's called ferry pilot work. And women were not initially thought of to do this sort of work, but some very forceful women, including Pauline Gower, who you can see there at the far right of the picture, who was in charge of the women's section of ATA throughout the war. They lobbied very hard for experienced women pilots to be allowed to join ATA. And as you can see, the first 8 arrived, looking quite formidable. But initially, they were not allowed to wear anything other than skirts when they were flying aeroplane. Even inside their flying suits, they had to make sure that they were wearing skirts and stockings at all times. As time went on, things changed. More women joined the service. And you can see from the bottom left picture that equality began to become part of the service. There you can see the pilots of both sexes grouped around the table for their morning chits, which told them which aeroplane they would fly. Aeroplanes, sometimes they were flying many short flights or even longer flights around Britain. And everyone, male or female, was flying every type of aircraft that was in the sky. They were not allowed to use radio. They were flying contact, so that they always had to have the ground in view. This made the conditions very dangerous as well as uncomfortable. Often they were flying in winter in open cockpits, and sometimes stuck out for days on end in places where they weren't meant to be because of bad weather. But also, really amazingly, for the time, the male and female pilots of ATA were paid equal pay. It was one of the first examples of equality in pay between men and women. So they really were trailblazers in lots of respect. And you can see there in the top left hand corner, there's Diana Bonato Walker, and she's at the controls there of an Avro Anson, which, if you've read the book, you'll know plays quite a big role in ATA life. Many of the pilots like her flew the most technically challenging and the most physically demanding aeroplanes of the war. And it was not without danger. As you can see at the bottom of the picture there, that is the crash site of a Hudson bomber that crashed just next to the airfield at White Waltham, which was the headquarters of ATA. And very sadly, 15 of the 164 women who served for ATA were killed in air accidents during the war. So these sort of stories just kept me completely involved in researching, reading about the war and about what happened to the women who were flying in Britain. There were anecdotes such as Diana, as you saw, her love of the Spitfire in the first photographs. On one occasion, she was flying a Spitfire, couldn't resist putting it into a roll, and unfortunately, her little makeup compact fell out of her flying coat, dropped onto the windows of the Spitfire, and covered the whole of the Perspex screen in powder. So she frantically had to right herself, scrape a little hole in the screen so she could see where she was going in the Spitfire. Another time, she was with some RAF chums, and they asked her if she could fly blind, flying cloud. And she said, no, we're not. We're told we must not never do that. If cloud comes down, we have to come down. And they said, but that's ridiculous. You must know how to do it. And so they drew some little diagrams on the pink tablecloths in the nightclub and explained to her how to fly with Dead Reckoning. And a couple of weeks later, those little diagrams actually saved her life when she did get caught in fog and realized the only way that she could get down and close to the airfield where she was supposed to be was to use those techniques that she'd been told. So all of those things really captivated me, even more so after I was lucky enough to take a couple of flights of my own in light aircraft, just like taster sessions of flying lessons, one of which, in fact, an aerobatic taster lesson was just by that field that you can see there in Wythe Waltham, where, unbeknown to me, that Hudson bomber had crashed during the war. Now, the question that eventually I did have to come up against was, what sort of book am I going to write with all of this information that I've amassed and all of these great stories that I know about ATA women? What shall I do with it? And I had the idea, I think possibly because I thought it was just going to be easier, that I would write a book for teenagers. And I thought the perfect subject for this would be the most famous ATA pilot of them all, and indeed one of the most famous people in Britain in the 1930s, and that was Amy Johnson. Now, Amy was an amazing person. Many of you will know who she is. She shot to fame really overnight almost in 1930 because of this incredible flight that she took from London to Australia, which she did almost breaking the actual record for the time of that flight in 19 days. But she was definitely the first woman to fly that route solo. And the newspapers in Britain and Australia went wild for Amy. She was an absolute sensation. And you can see what a glamorous, attractive figure she was, you know, from these photographs. In 1940, Amy joined Air Transport Auxiliary. And for her, it was something of a come down. Now, she was a very experienced engineer as well as a pilot, but her flying had really been in small open cockpit planes in a very limited range of planes. And it's possible that she was a little bit burdened by her fame in that people expected her to be a brilliant pilot. Whereas what the ATA were doing was flying a different type of plane, sometimes several times a day. So it was versatility really that was the important thing. And perhaps Amy felt it difficult sometimes to ask for help. So as you can see from the headlines there, the worst did happen. And Amy did that thing that the ATA pilots were never supposed to do. She tried to go over the top. When low cloud came down, and you can see the plane here flying over cloud, she tried to do the same in this exactly the same type of plane, the Airspeed Oxford, the twin engine bomber, which she ended up being her very last flight. It's a little bit mysterious, really, Amy's final flight and her death, because no one really knows exactly what happened to her, and her body was never recovered. But she was meant to be flying from Blackpool to Oxford, and the plane actually went down in the Thames estuary just off Kent. So she was way off course. Something had gone really badly wrong. And a very brave man who thought he saw her in the water near where the plane had come down dived in to try and save her. And Captain Fletcher, his name was, he died in hospital 7 days later from hypothermia because of that attempt. But there was no body, there was no Amy. And I just thought this story, all of these stories about Amy, were perfect, really, to put into a novel for teenagers about a girl who hero worships Amy and tries to emulate her by joining ATA. But unfortunately, it was a complete flop. I just wasn't able to write convincingly or well enough for teenagers. And so that novel unfortunately sank without a trace, but my writing bug continued. I was still determined to make a success of this pursuit that I'd now become really enamored of. And I decided that I would have to take a break from World War II and write something completely different. So I thought of looking at Victorian Birmingham and a thriller and psychological subjects like nature versus nurture. And any one of you who've read it will recognise that that is a description of The Conviction of Cora Burns, which was my debut novel and which turned out to be more successful than my early attempts at the World War II novel. But once I had finished with Cora, I knew that I was going to have to go back to my World War II pilots. They just would not leave me alone. But because I was now much more experienced, having written that thriller for adults, I knew that what I wanted to write was the sort of book that I really wanted to read. And so I came back to the war thinking that I would make the story much more into a dark love story and a thriller and perhaps an adventure story as well, all rolled into one. And so I needed some new elements for my World War II story. And I started looking at the Polish squadrons of World War II, partly for my love interest for a World War II pilot. And you can see from the picture here of these rather dashing pilots, just how attractive some of these World War II Polish pilots were to the British female population. They had a reputation for being extremely brave, perhaps reckless in the air, very confident, but also full of high spirits and fun-loving. And you can see all that really in this photograph of these guys from the famous 303 squadron. And if you can see, if you've got a good enough picture on your screen, that you can see just below the cockpit there, those little crosses. Each one of those is a kill. It's a German plane that this very Spitfire has shot down. And given that you only had to have 5 kills to become an ace, you can see that this Spitfire has had twice or 3 times that number. These Polish guys were the top of the fighter pilot tree. So definitely they were going to be in my story. Even more so once my family had welcomed my brother's lovely Polish wife into our family, and we started to find out more about Poland. And I visited Poland and my sister-in-law's family. And suddenly it was personal. Suddenly I wanted to know a lot more about the Polish experience of war and the backstory of some of these pilots. And what immediately came to light was early in the war, the massacre at Katyn. And in that massacre of Polish prisoners of war, which is really at the heart of my book, it was just a spooky moment when I read that there was in fact one solitary female victim of this massacre, of the 22,000 prisoners of war killed. And that female pilot, she's there, Janina Lewandowska, was a pilot like my British pilots. It was just seemed like fate that I would have to include Janina somewhere in my story. And again, the more I started to find out about Janina and the experience of the early part of the war in Poland, the more dramatic it was, the more important to include in the story. And one of the privileges really of having the book published has been that I've actually, since publication, been in touch with some of Janina's relatives as a result of them finding out about the book. And you can see here in the top left, there is Janina on her wedding day to Mieczysław Lewandowski. And it's been amazing to find out from some of Janina's blood relatives and from Mieczysław's relatives what happened to the family after the war and more details about Janina's life. She was an incredible woman, like many of the British pilots, obsessed with flight from an early age. But Janina's real passion was actually parachuting. And in the 1930s, she held the European record for the highest parachute jump by a woman, jumping from 5 kilometers high, which is amazing even now, but especially in the 1930s. And Mieczysław, her husband there in the photo, he was actually her gliding instructor. She was a qualified glider as well, and that rather beautifully their wedding photos were taken in front of the glider that they like to fly. So again, it was other side of Europe, but again, so many people at that point obsessed with flight and became a major part of their lives. Now, really sadly, not long after this wedding photograph was taken in the summer of 1939, the war began, and it began first in Poland, of course. And after the initial German invasion from the west, you can see on this this map, only 2 weeks later, there was the Soviet Union invasion from the east. So Poland, although it was a very well-equipped army, contrary to a lot of the myths about the Polish forces at the time, it was a huge number of combatants involved in their forces and well-equipped. You can see the Polish Air Force there in the top right-hand picture with their modern Karas bomber aircraft, but it was still no match for the joint might of Germany and the Soviet Union coming together and just overwhelming the Polish nation. Now, Janina and Mieczysław, because they were qualified pilots and reservists in the Polish Air Force, they were immediately called up to serve, and that point was the last time that they ever saw each other. Janina went off to the Eastern Front, and from there, like so many others, was captured by the Soviet army. And from there, she was taken as a prisoner of war to the very heart of Russia, almost as far east as Moscow, and to this rather amazing place called Kozyelsk, which is an ancient monastery that during the Second World War was converted into a prisoner of war camp. Now, if anyone is interested in this subject, and it is fascinating, I would really recommend that you seek out this film. There's a still from the film here on the top right of your screen. It's a film simply called Katyn, and it tells better really than any of the books I've come across the story of why so many thousands of Polish prisoners of war found the end of their lives in the forest of Katyn. In this still, you can see what to me looks like a perfect recreation from the memoirs I've read of the citadel, the church at the heart of the Kozyelsk monastery, where the bunks were piled up like multi-story sleeping arrangements. The prisoners of war sleeping on top of each other, and their breath, so many crammed into the monastery, their breath formed ice on the walls. But despite all that, they were not treated harshly by the Soviets. And over that winter of 1939 to 40, many of them were optimistic that they would be released. And of course, amongst these thousands of men in the prisoner of war camp, there was just one solitary woman, Yanina. And we know from eyewitness accounts that she was housed separately. She was kept in one of these huts you can see down in the foreground at the bottom right of the screen. She was seen by the men. They saw her, they said, striding around the camp for her exercise, looking very elegant in her Air Force blue uniform. And one of the Polish survivors said that he felt as though when he saw her that Joan of Arc had been reincarnated in their midst. But unfortunately, Yanina met the same fate as the overwhelming majority of the prisoners there in the camp. And they were taken in the spring of 1940 to the forest of Katyn. And there, almost 22,000 of the prisoners were killed by a single bullet wound to the back of the head. Not long after that, the following year, everything changed in the war when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and of course Stalin changed sides and began to fight for the Allies. But because of that invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans were the ones who occupied the forest of Katyn, and it was they that discovered the mass graves of the Polish prisoners of war. They in fact found one of the bodies. They were carefully exhuming the bodies and preserving the evidence that they found in order to try and prove it was Stalin who had killed these people and not Hitler's troops. And amongst these bodies that were found, there was one that was extremely definitely a woman. For some reason, the Germans didn't publicize this fact, but they did label the body as such, and it was kept preserved. Now, what happened then, I won't go into here. Let's just say read the book and you will find out a bit about the excavation and the preservation of the grave goods that were found. But much later, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a democratic republic in Poland, it emerged that the remains of Janina were being held in the University of Wrocław, and after the corpse was completely identified definitively, Janina was buried in the family grave, which you can see here near Poznan, which brought her story to a final and very tragic conclusion. So where are we with my novel? Well, after 10 years of work and writing, not the whole time, as I say, I wrote 2 books in that period, but I've been thinking about the wartime story for those 10 years, and I'd written at least 6 very distinct novels, all a bit different, all with a similar sort of story and similar elements. But I've probably written about 500,000 words on this story over that time. And I had my lovely publisher in Harpenden, No Exit Press, and hooray, they were interested in my wartime story as my second novel after Cora Burns. But we still, I think, both felt there was something not quite right about the version that I had, the final version you see there, which I called Fall. I wasn't quite right. We were nearly there, but there was a problem with it, really, in that the 2 female protagonists, one an English pilot, one a Polish partisan, were telling the story, but my Polish character Eva was just so much more charismatic than the English pilot. The balance wasn't right. I needed to make my English character more interesting and perhaps a little less English. And I went back to my ATA research, and as soon as I saw this lady coming up, Monique Agazarian, I knew that I'd found the inspiration for my pilot, V. Khatchaturian, who is the heroine of When We Fall. So thank you, Monique. In fact, everyone who knew her called her Aggie. That was her kind of nickname. In the best tradition of all pilots have got a kind of nickname, and Monique Agazarian was Aggie. Now, she has a lot in common with V, my pilot in the book. Aggie's father was from Armenia, and he actually fled Armenia to escape the genocide that happened there in the early part of the 20th century. And again, when I read that, I felt an immediate connection really with the Polish experience of Katyn, that the 2 things would resonate with each other. So that was important. And also, like V, Aggie was one of the later intake in the ATA. She was someone who was obsessed with flight from an early age, possibly because her mother, needing something to occupy her 6 children, had bought an old aeroplane at an auction, a written off Sopwith pup for £5, and had put it in the garden for the children to use as a climbing frame. Needless to say, they all became plain mad, not just Aggie, but her 2 brothers. One, Noel, was a Battle Britain ace who died in aerial combat during the war. And another amazing person, Jack Agazarian, was an undercover SOE agent who was parachuted into occupied France, and again, tragically, was murdered by the Gestapo just 2 months before the end of the war. But despite these tragedies, the grief that she must have felt, Aggie did have a fantastic time flying her planes for ATA. she'd been absolutely determined to get into their ab initio cadet training program. She even persuaded the RAF doctor to add 1/2 inch to her height so that she would meet the medical requirements to get into the Air Transport Auxiliary program. And she did really well, and you can see there her on the wing of a Spitfire looking euphoric. And she was actually chosen to fly the celebratory Spitfire along the length of Piccadilly on VJ Day, which was the very end of the war. And the end of the war for some ATA pilots was extremely exciting. You can see there at the top of the screen one of the ATA pilots, Zita Irwin, who was lucky enough to be chosen to fly a transport plane to Berlin in July 1945. And she's there with the Soviet troops, the victorious Soviet troops, actually inside the ruins of Hitler's chancellery in Berlin. But for most of the women of ATA, the winding up of the organisation in November 1945 was a rather sad event. You can see the flag coming down there for the last time. And many of the Air Transport Auxiliary women pilots would look back on the war as the kind of pinnacle of their professional life. And they never again managed to be able to fly aircraft professionally. But not so Aggie. Aggie, there she is, amazing Aggie. She got round the difficulty of being recruited by an airline as a pilot by setting up her own airline. It was Island Air Services, a charter airline that flew around Britain and especially the Channel Islands in the 1950s. And she went on to be a pioneer of using air simulators for pilot training. And completely coincidentally and unbeknown to me, the base of her simulator business was at a little airfield near High Wycombe. And it was there that I actually went for my taster flying lesson at the very start of this research journey to research the women, airwomen of the war and their experience. So there was a sort of a strange connection there, which I wasn't aware of until much later. And in fact, there were so many spooky and spine-tingling connections and coincidences with this book that I felt all along that it was the one that I couldn't let go of. I really did have to bring it to a conclusion, and I'm absolutely delighted that it is out in the world now, thanks to No Exit Press, and really glad that I've been able to tell you a bit about how it came to be this evening. So we'll try not to have too much technical messing about now, but I will try and unmute you all. And if you have some questions, you can again either chat, put them in the chat, type them in the chat if you don't want to speak, or I think you can put a hand up and ask a question out loud. We will see how this goes because I'm not sure which will be the best way, but let us give us a go. So.
Thank you for that, Carolyn. We just at the very end there had a bit of problem, some of us, with it seemed as though you froze on the screen and we got a bit of static and a bit of delay, but I hope you all heard that last bit all right. So if any of you've got some questions that you'd like to ask, please, you know, just go like this and take your mute off and ask if you'd like to. I'm sure some of you have, because it was such an interesting talk. I'm sure you'll agree. I think, Paul, did I see that you'd like to ask a question? No? Okay, so I have got a few that I will start with, and if you think of any, please do put your hand up and we will go into that. So one of my questions, Carolyn, is what happened to the women that were still in the ATA after the war ended?
Well, the war ended, as far as ATA went, more or less on VE Day, which was in May 1945. And they were really had very little to do. If you read the book, the final section gives a sense of that fact that the flying work started to be taken back by the RAF. There wasn't much for the ATA pilots to do, and especially the women. Because although there was that equality during the active part of the war, the men started to muscle in at the end. They were the ones who were getting airline jobs. They were the ones who were taking the choice flights. So when the whole organisation was finally wound up in the November, that was, as I say, kind of the end really for most of the women of them ever working as pilots again. There was only a handful like Aggie and another pilot called Jackie Soror, who did manage to become an aircraft pilot. But in general, no, they went on to other forms of work or to their families.
You also say it's only the picture that's distorted, so there's nothing you do about it.
Yeah. So as a follow-on question, really, Carolyn, from Marcia.
So I'm sorry.
Deb, you've muted yourself.
I know, I'm
Right.
sorry.
Thank you, Shirley. Yes, so following on.
Sorry, can you just repeat that, Deb? I didn't hear that.
So from Marcia, she asked, did ATA pilots get benefits after the war? Were they considered military veterans?
No, they weren't. And that was the real sort of injustice, really. The ATA, although it was run by the Air Ministry, was definitely a civilian organisation. So the people flying, the pilots flying for ATA, it was considered a reserved occupation. But in general, they were men who were too old to be in the RAF or had some medical problem which stopped them serving in the forces. And so they were never given military honours or military pension or anything like that. At the end of their lives, I think it was about 10 years ago, a special medal was created to honour their service. Many of them had already passed away, but those that were surviving went to Downing Street and received this medal to recognise their service, because although it was non-military, it was extremely dangerous from the sort of conditions that I described, and there was a high number of fatalities. Yes, the definitive book about the ATA for many years was called The Forgotten Pilots, and that really is how they saw themselves.
All right. So I hope that's answered your question, Marcia. Another question, have any Polish people read the book? And if so, what did they think of it?
Well, very excitingly, the book has been sold to a Polish publisher. So it is, as we speak, with a translator who is translating it into Polish, and there will be a publication there next year. So I'm just really fascinated to know how it will be received in Poland. I mean, I've done a lot of research, but I'm not Polish, and I'm writing about their country. So I'll just be fascinated to see how what they make of it and what the reception is. But there was more than one publisher interested in it, so they must feel that it is telling them something about their own country. And researching the country, it's such a complex history. It's so fraught with contradictions, some of which I hope I bring out in the book, about nationality, really, and about national identity, and about their experience of the war and the contradictions that every occupied country had, during that period. I slightly wonder if coming at it, perhaps in sort of blissful ignorance as I did, gave me a kind of clean slate to work with in terms of looking at what was happening there with a clear eye. I don't know, but I just sense that there might be a weight of all sorts of history on someone who was more intimately connected to the country. But it's a wonderful place. And I mean, Poznan, which I describe in the book, if you get the chance to go, just go. It's such an amazing city. It's so beautiful, so easy and cheap to get there as well. It's really worthwhile.
When people can fly again, Carolyn, easily.
When we can fly again, yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I have another question here from Anita. She says, thank you, Carolyn, for a fascinating talk. Can you tell us what you're working on now?
Thank you, Anita. Yes, I am. I've been working this year during lockdown on a book, a novel set in the 18th century. So very different again to my two previous works. It's again a fascinating period. I'm trying not to get too bogged down in my research into the Georgian Navy and into the complicated wardrobes of 18th century women. But all these things are amazing and they will play a part in the book. But it's about a boy who grows up in Whitehaven and likes more than anything to try on his sister's clothes. So that's my starting point, and a lot will happen during his life, but he's a very funny guy, and I am really enjoying writing this book, which I hope will be a bit of a cross between Outlander and RuPaul's Drag Race. So that's my pitch for it.
Well, I've got another question, actually, going back to the one we're discussing. How much training would women pilots have had before they flew? Because in the book, it seems like they're just given the book, the manual, and told to get on with it, really.
Yeah, well, it was about a couple of months. So Aggie and so V, who's following her sort of footsteps, yes, they start from scratch, and there was a very efficient flight training course. That's how they were able to do it. They had a very intense but a very thorough grounding in a basics pilot's license. And then they were given techniques on how to fly the different types of aircraft that they would be faced with. And there was this nifty little thing called the Ferry Pilot's Notes that was just a little cardboard folder, sometimes tied together at the top with shoelaces, and one page, one aircraft. The single page gave you all of the vital facts and figures to be able to get every aircraft in the sky into the sky and to fly it safely without any flourishes, but to fly it from A to B. And many of the women, they describe in their memoirs how, there would be quite a complex aircraft, a twin engine bomber, perhaps. They never flown one before. They got out their Ferry Pilot's Notes, turned on the ignition, and off they went, and obviously lived to tell the tale. So yes, it was quick, but these were people who were extremely keen on flying, extremely committed. And you have to remember that even though they only had a couple of months, that was still more than many of the RAF pilots got. Sometimes that would only be weeks. They were nevertheless flying a lot more different types of aircraft than a single RAF pilot would do, but they weren't flying them to the same sort of technical level. So it was a completely different approach to the two flying experiences. but yeah, it's fascinating. All this stuff is just really amazing.
So your previous novel was set in the 19th century. Is
Yeah.
that the era that you did as you know, when you were at university doing history? Was that something that you came to then, or you became fascinated with then?
Well, to some extent, yes. Actually, thinking about it, I wrote a dissertation, and the dissertation was about the Contagious Diseases Act in the 1860s, which, for anyone who knows about that, will know that that is to do with regulating prostitution. So yeah, that was my interest, my special interest. But the thing about the degree that I did at the time, and I don't know how similar it is now, but it was everything really. Modern history, as far as the Oxford degree was concerned, started in the year 480 and went through to the modern day. And I think that's why I feel as a novelist that I have to, that it really motivates me to start with an era and a setting that I don't know anything about. And it's that researching something which is new, kind of similar to how I would get my essay topic and by the end of a couple of weeks have got some sort of expertise in the subject. The same with the novels, really. I can't imagine going back to a period or to a setting. I always want to research and explore something that's new.
So in research, how different did you find the research for your first book and the book that we're just talking about now? Was there any difference in the research or how you went about it?
I'd learned my lesson a bit with the pilots. As I explained, I just got really suffocated really by the research for that, by doing too much of it and by not being able to see the wood for the trees, really. With Cora, and more especially with the current novel that I'm working on, I think about the story first, and then when I come up against something I need to research, I research it. I'm not researching everything and looking for a story. I've got my story. I just need to make sure that it's authentic, and that you know, I'm sort of steeped in the language, the mindset, the thinking of the period, but not necessarily, you know, the everyday realities of, you know, what cauliflowers were used for in 18th century Whitehaven, you know. Although I am a little bit interested in that.
Well, and if there's no more questions from everybody, at some point, Carolyn, you might like to look at the chat. There's some very nice comments, not questions, but just comments about the talk. So that was, you need to read those. They're lovely. So I want, if there's no more questions, I can't see anything else coming up on the chat. I want to thank everybody for attending. Obviously, many thanks to Carolyn to do this for us. As I say, it is part of Libraries Week, and we're very lucky to have Carolyn to do this for us. Please don't forget that you can donate to libraries. You can go on our Facebook site and donate. But obviously, you will have seen also that Carolyn very kindly has put, I think there's a discount for your book through the talk. But also, when you tell others about it, do come in the library and see us. So I want again just end up thanking the publisher and Carolyn, and for all of you for going on this journey with us, not just the ones on the flying, but having a trial of the way we do the events while we're still in all this COVID. So I want to say stay safe and well, and thank you very much for attending.